In 1949, the State of Israel was declared, prompting an invasion by neighboring Arab countries and the First Arab-Israeli War, which after the victory of Israel led to the enlargement of the state and several more conflicts in the region which we're only too aware of today. This video, however, isn't going to be talking about the politics, certainly not of the modern period or about the 20th century State of Israel, but rather about the language that's spoken there, as the language of the State of Israel already back then was Hebrew. Hebrew being a very ancient language from the region that had once been a majority that had been spoken and used for sacred texts, but that had largely fallen out of fashion by around 400 AD, being replaced as a spoken language for most Jews around the Mediterranean by Greek and Aramaic, to name just two. Hebrew would continue as a religious language, being a holy language in which the Jewish holy books were written and which was still used in prayers as well as in smaller circles. But for most of Europe, particularly Eastern and Central Europe, it would be replaced as a spoken language by Yiddish. For a long time then, Yiddish was the language spoken by the majority of Jews on earth. The Yiddish language has been described by P. Johnson as a rich, living language, the chattering tongue of an urban population. It had the limitations of its origins. There were few Yiddish words for animals and birds. It had virtually no military vocabulary. Such voids were filled by borrowing from German, Polish, and Russian. Yiddish was particularly good at borrowing from Arabic, from Hebrew, from Aramaic, and from anything with which it intersected. On the other hand, it contributed to English, American. Its chief virtue lay in its internal subtlety, particularly in its characterization of human types and emotions. It was the language of street wisdom, of the clever underdog, of pathos, resignation and suffering, all of which it palliated by humor, intense irony, and superstition. Isaac Bashevis Singer, its greatest practitioner, pointed out that it is the only language never spoken by men in power. At the dawn of the Second World War in 1939, Yiddish was the first language of some 12 million people. However, because of the horrors of the Second World War, over 5 million of those first language Yiddish speakers were murdered, with the majority of the remaining speakers then emigrating to Israel. It then stands to reason that Yiddish would be in a very strong position as such an ancestral language spoken by such a large number of Jews that went to Israel, that this would become the national language. But instead, Hebrew is the language that was chosen. And in today's video, I want to answer, why was this the case? Serious efforts to revive Hebrew as both a spoken and a literary language outside of solely religious function already were underway in the Haskalah, which is the term mostly used to describe the Enlightenment period within Jewish scholarship, so ranging from the 18th century through the 19th century as well. Here, for example, we see a Hebrew translation of William Shakespeare from 1816. There would be a similar movement that would eventually converge with the literary movement to get spoken Hebrew back as the main spoken language of most Jews, although this would only really come to fruition after the large-scale migration of Jews to the British Mandate and later to the State of Israel. Now, to do this, they actually had to reconstruct Hebrew because the Hebrew that was found in sacred texts was several thousand years old at that point and no longer really viable as a spoken language given the way that it had been written down. And so people had to come up with many new terms to describe the new things that had been invented, new concepts, etc., that had come in the several thousand years since these texts had been written. And several very prominent Jewish minds put to thinking about these questions and to then reviving the Hebrew language to be used. Now, as we can see, a very important factor involved in this was the Zionist movement, the movement of Jews from various parts of the world to the Middle East, particularly to the British Mandate of Palestine following its takeover from the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. It therefore stands to reason that a common language was very much in the interest of all these disparate peoples who had many different mother tongues but still had to learn to work together within these settlements. Indeed, it is with Zionism that we get the real impulse for a revival of the Hebrew language in a spoken form. At the same time, we see that many of these Zionist protagonists of Hebrew were very much against the use of Yiddish. So, one of the most important Zionists, Theodor Herzl, wrote about the Yiddish language: "We shall get rid of the stunted and squashed jargons which we use now, these ghetto languages. They were the furtive tongues of prisoners." Many of these Zionists would refuse to use the Yiddish language at all, preferring to use German to communicate with other Jews, and those that were involved in the revivalist movement would try and speak and write as much Hebrew as possible instead of Yiddish. It seems somewhat paradoxical, but actually it appears that the more secular Zionists promoted the use of Hebrew as the main language of the Jewish community, while more religious Jews were more in favor of continuing to use Yiddish. While this seems somewhat paradoxical, especially because it's these more religious Jews who would be reading and studying the Torah and other texts in Hebrew, they felt that this was the language of God and shouldn't be used outside of very religious settings and indeed religious texts, while the more secular Jews who promoted Zionism and wanted a return back to an ancestral homeland also wished to revive this ancestral language and were less concerned with the religious implications of doing so. A third language that was very important, particularly in schooling, was German, as German had already started to replace Yiddish in Jewish community schools, particularly in Central Europe throughout the 19th century. And so there was a struggle in the British Mandate of Palestine's Jewish settlements whether they should be using this new revived Hebrew in schools or whether they should be using German. This period has sometimes been described as a language war within the British Mandate of Palestine and the early state of Israel. There were several movements of the Zionist proponents of Hebrew that were very radical in their opinions, even tearing down posters written in especially Yiddish, but also other European languages, and disrupting plays that were held in Yiddish. One of their slogans would be that Hebrews, that is to say Jews, speak Hebrew. And so they felt very strongly that Yiddish was not a language that should be used, especially in this new state of Israel that they were wishing to create. And they were very militant in their opinions. How effective they were, however, is unclear. Now, while it was a serious possibility that in the early migrations to the British Mandate of Palestine, where, of course, most of the speakers that were coming from Europe were Yiddish speakers, Yiddish mother tongue speakers, things dramatically changed, particularly in favor of using Hebrew as the main language from 1949. At the end of the First Arab-Israeli War, most Arab countries decided to expel their sizable Jewish populations. Some 900,000 Jews were expelled from various countries across North Africa and the Arab world, and just over 2/3 of those that were expelled decided to settle in the state of Israel, owing to the aliyah, or right of return, of Jewish people to this new state of Israel that had been created. Now, these were Jews that had been living in Arab countries, some for millennia, others for centuries, and that had moved around quite a lot. But the main languages that they were speaking were not Hebrew, as this language had, as I mentioned, was really just a religious language used mainly for texts outside of this revivalist movement. The main languages that they spoke were Arabic, oftentimes Judeo-Arabic. Some spoke Greek. Others, for example, those from Morocco and other parts of North Africa, might have spoken French. But none of them spoke Yiddish, because Yiddish was a purely European Jewish phenomenon spoken by Ashkenazi Jews. So especially those that knew how to speak Arabic, learning to speak Hebrew, another Semitic language, was considerably easier than having to learn the Germanic language of Yiddish, a language that they didn't really associate with and was being seen as increasingly more European, something from the old time, rather than from the ancient or holy time as Hebrew was, something that people in the state of Israel felt could link them together, despite the several centuries or at times millennia that separated European Jews from North African Jews, to name just a few. In more recent decades, however, the state of Israel has been more open towards Yiddish and Yiddish influence, probably because the revival of Hebrew has been so successful that it is now the dominant language in all official and private domains. In 1996, the Knesset, or Parliament, passed a new law that allowed for the National Authority for Yiddish Culture to be established, which hosts plays and language schools in Yiddish, as well as promoting Yiddish art and translations of Yiddish classics into Hebrew as well. In 2024, so today, it's estimated that there are around 600,000 Yiddish speakers in the world, around 200,000 of which live in the state of Israel and are able to communicate in Yiddish if they want, even though Hebrew remains the majority language there. Some have argued, though, that the influence of Yiddish far exceeds this rather small number that still exists today in the state of Israel and actually had a very important role in shaping modern Hebrew as we find it. The main proponent of this idea is Gilad Zuckerman, who has suggested that Israeli, that's his term for the new Hebrew that was created in Israel, does include numerous Hebrew elements resulting from a conscious revival, but also numerous pervasive linguistic features deriving from a subconscious survival of the revivalists' mother tongues, e.g., Yiddish. This is an important point because many of these early Zionists who were reviving Hebrew spoke Yiddish as a first language. So even if they were consciously trying to revive an ancient language, there were still subconscious linguistic biases from their own mother tongue that have made their way into Hebrew. And this he demonstrates by showing several different features of modern Israeli that differ from ancient Hebrew, and he can quite conclusively point that many of these have come from Yiddish. So, for example, in terms of how sentences are given meaning, whether a language uses inflectional endings or whether it uses word order to denote the meaning. And he has shown that Israeli is more analytic, just like Yiddish, so using prepositions. I go to the shop rather than I go shopping to show I have gone to the shop. In other cases, it's how verbs are formed and how the direct object are used, or gender, which look more like European languages rather than Semitic languages. And this shows some of the influence of Yiddish that it has had on modern Israeli Hebrew. But anyway, let me know what you think about Hebrew and Israeli. Could there have been an alternate universe in which Israel's main language would have been Yiddish instead of Hebrew? And do you think in the future Yiddish will survive in Hebrew, or will it be completely replaced by Hebrew, as that is the direction that it seems to have gone in, although now the government has eased up a little bit on Yiddish there. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I thought this was an interesting video topic to make, independent of course, the horrible things that are going on in that part of the world now. I find languages very interesting. I've had quite a lot of exposure to Yiddish, both through my dad's Amsterdam dialect words that have been influenced, and living for a year very close to the Jewish community in Gateshead, where you hear Yiddish on the street quite a lot. I haven't had quite as much exposure to Hebrew, but I thought it'd be interesting to make a video about this. Anyhow, thank you all very much for watching. I hope everyone stays safe, hope everyone enjoyed this video, and I will see you all again very soon.